The fork was still in Michael Harrison's hand when his family vanished forever. October 15, 1978. A quiet Tuesday evening in suburban Milwaukee. The mashed potatoes were getting cold, the roast beef still steaming on the platter, and 4 empty chairs sat around a dining room table that would haunt investigators for nearly 5 decades. Before we dive into this chilling mystery, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're about to uncover a story that was deliberately buried, a story that someone never wanted you to hear. And trust me, what we found will change everything you thought you knew about missing persons cases. Picture this: the Harrison family. Michael, 42, worked as an accountant at a local firm. Sarah, 39, taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary. Their twin daughters, Emma and Lucy, just turned 16 that September. By all accounts, they were the definition of ordinary: church on Sundays, family game nights, the kind of neighbors who'd shovel your driveway without being asked. But on that October evening, ordinary became impossible to explain. The last confirmed sighting was Mrs. Henderson from next door. She saw Sarah through the kitchen window around 6:30, stirring something on the stove. The house was warm, glowing with that golden light that made everything look like a Norman Rockwell painting. 20 minutes later, complete silence. Not a scream, not a struggle, not even a door slamming. Just 4 people who seemed to dissolve into thin air. When Michael's brother came by the next morning for their weekly coffee, he found the front door unlocked. The table was set for 4. Dinner was served, plates filled, utensils positioned as if the family had just sat down to eat. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. Michael's fork was suspended in mid-air, still clutched in his rigid fingers, a piece of roast beef speared on the end. The scene was so perfectly preserved it looked staged, like someone had hit pause on a normal family dinner and simply erased the people from the frame. Police arrived within the hour. Detective Raymond Cole, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything from domestic disputes to organized crime, later said the Harrison house was the most unsettling crime scene of his career. Not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No jimmied locks. The back door was closed and secured from the inside. Every window was latched. The security chain on the front door was still engaged, meaning whoever left had used the front door and somehow managed to secure the chain from the outside, which was physically impossible. The family's car sat in the driveway, keys hanging on the hook by the kitchen door. Sarah's purse was on the counter, wallet intact, credit cards untouched. Michael's briefcase was by the front door, exactly where he always left it. The girls' backpacks were in their rooms, homework half finished on their desks. It was as if the Harrisons had simply evaporated. The investigation consumed the Milwaukee Police Department for months. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, distant relatives. They combed through bank records, phone logs, medical files. They brought in bloodhounds, psychics, even a team from the FBI. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every theory crumbled under scrutiny. The house itself became a monument to the unexplained. Local newspapers ran weekly updates for the first year, then monthly, then not at all. The Harrison name faded from headlines, relegated to the cold case files that gathered dust in basement storage rooms. The house was eventually sold to a young couple who lasted 6 months before moving out, claiming they heard voices in the walls. After that, 847 Maple Street became the neighborhood's haunted house. Kids dared each other to touch the front door on Halloween. Urban legends sprouted like weeds. Some said the family was taken by aliens. Others whispered about government experiments or underground cults. But as years turned to decades, even the legends began to fade. The house changed hands 7 more times over the next 4 decades. Each owner seemed to last a little longer than the last, but none stayed permanently. Something about the place felt wrong, they'd say. Too quiet, too heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. By 2020, the property had been vacant for 3 years. The paint was peeling, the lawn overgrown, the windows boarded up. The city was considering demolition when a real estate developer named Patricia Morse bought it for a fraction of its value. She planned to gut the interior and flip it for a quick profit. Patricia wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. She was practical, no nonsense, the kind of woman who saw dollar signs where others saw doom. But even she had to admit there was something unsettling about the house. The way shadows seemed to move when they shouldn't. The way certain rooms felt colder than others, even in the middle of summer. She hired a crew to start clearing out the basement, and that's when they found it, hidden behind a false wall that had been expertly concealed for over 4 decades. A storage room that didn't appear on any of the original blueprints. A room that shouldn't have existed. Inside, they discovered something that would crack the Harrison case wide open, a vintage camera, still loaded with film that had been waiting in the dark for 47 years. The camera was a 1970s Polaroid SX70, the kind that was revolutionary at the time, but now looked like a relic from another era. It was sitting on a small table, positioned as if someone had just set it down moments before. Next to it was a notebook, its pages filled with handwritten observations in a neat, methodical script. But here's what made Patricia's blood run cold. The camera was pointed directly at a chair, a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the room, with restraints still attached to the armrests. The notebook contained dates, times, and what appeared to be behavioral observations. The handwriting was clinical, detached, like someone was conducting an experiment. The entries began 3 days before the Harrison family disappeared and continued for months afterward. Patricia knew she was looking at something that could rewrite history. She called the police immediately, but by then, most of the original investigators had retired or died. Detective Cole was in his 80s, living in a nursing home, his memories of the case fading with age. The new generation of investigators treated the discovery with the skepticism it deserved. Cold cases were notoriously difficult to solve, and after 47 years, the chances of finding meaningful evidence were slim to none. But they agreed to process the camera and develop whatever film remained inside. What they found defied explanation. The photographs showed the Harrison family, but not as anyone remembered them. These weren't family portraits or candid shots from a birthday party. These were surveillance photos, taken without the subject's knowledge. Photos of the family going about their daily routines, unaware they were being watched. Michael reading the newspaper in his favorite chair. Sarah grading papers at the kitchen table, the twins doing homework in their bedroom. The twins, mundane moments that suddenly felt sinister when viewed through the lens of what happened next. But the final photo was different. It showed the dining room on the night of October 15, 1978. The family was seated around the table, but their expressions were wrong. They weren't eating. They weren't talking. They were staring directly at the camera with looks of pure terror, and standing behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure that investigators couldn't identify. The photograph was grainy, taken in low light, but forensic experts enhanced it as much as possible. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the department. The figure wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had been part of the original investigation. Someone who had access to the crime scene, who knew every detail of the case, who had been trusted to find the truth. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly, the perfect preservation of the crime scene made sense. The lack of forced entry, the impossible security chain, the way evidence seemed to disappear or lead nowhere. It wasn't mysterious at all. It was methodical. But identifying the figure was only the beginning. The notebook contained enough information to piece together what really happened that October evening, and the truth was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The Harrison family hadn't vanished. They had been taken, and for reasons that would become clear as the investigation unfolded, their disappearance was just the beginning of something much larger, much more sinister than a simple missing persons case. The camera had been waiting in that hidden room for 47 years, like a time bomb set to explode decades after the crime. And when it finally did, it would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement, a network of corruption that had been operating in plain sight for nearly half a century. The investigation into the enhanced photograph became a race against time. Detective Sarah Martinez, the lead investigator on the reopened case, knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. The figure in the shadows wasn't just any member of the original investigation team. It was Detective Raymond Cole himself, the same man who had described the Harrison house as the most unsettling crime scene of his career. But Cole was now 84 years old, his mind deteriorating in the nursing home where he spent his final days. When Martinez arrived to question him, she found a man who drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes sharp as a tack, sometimes lost in memories that may or may not have been real. "Detective Cole," Martinez began gently, showing him the enhanced photograph. "Can you tell me about this image?" Cole's eyes focused on the photo, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Recognition. Fear. Then his expression went blank again. "I don't remember," he whispered. "There's so much I don't remember." But Martinez was persistent. She returned day after day, slowly piecing together fragments of Cole's recollections. And what emerged was a story that challenged everything she thought she knew about police work, about justice, about the thin line between those who enforce the law and those who break it. According to Cole's fragmented confessions, the Harrison family had stumbled onto something they shouldn't have seen. Michael Harrison, the quiet accountant, had been doing more than just balancing books at his firm. He'd discovered a money laundering operation that connected local businesses to organized crime, and the trail led directly to members of the Milwaukee Police Department. The night of October 15, 1978, wasn't random. It was an execution disguised as a disappearance. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The family wasn't killed immediately. They were taken to a secondary location, a place where they could be interrogated about what they knew and who they might have told. The hidden room Patricia Morse found in the basement wasn't just a storage space. It was a makeshift interrogation chamber, complete with recording equipment and restraints. The camera had been used to document the questioning, to create a record of what was extracted from each family member before they were disposed of. Cole's notebook contained detailed accounts of the interrogation sessions. Michael had been first, and he'd broken quickly under pressure. He revealed that he'd made copies of the incriminating financial records and hidden them in a safety deposit box downtown. But when investigators checked the box decades later, it was empty. Someone had cleaned it out long ago. Sarah had been questioned about her husband's work, about whether he'd confided in her about his discoveries. The notes described her as uncooperative and emotional, but they also revealed something else. She'd been pregnant, a detail that had never been part of the original investigation, a fifth victim who had never been counted. The twins, Emma and Lucy, had been the most heartbreaking entries in the notebook. They'd been questioned not about their father's work, but about their daily routines, their friends, their teachers. The interrogator had been looking for any sign that the family had shared their knowledge with others, any loose thread that might unravel the conspiracy. But as Martinez read through the clinical descriptions of fear and desperation, she realized something crucial. The notebook entries continued for months after the family's disappearance, which meant they hadn't been killed immediately. They'd been held somewhere, kept alive for interrogation and observation. The final entry in the notebook was dated February 14, 1979, Valentine's Day. It simply read, "Subjects no longer useful. Disposal complete. Site sanitized." Martinez felt sick reading those words. 4 people, plus an unborn child, reduced to clinical terminology. Subjects, disposal, sanitized, as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings with dreams and fears and people who loved them. But the notebook contained something else that made Martinez's investigation even more urgent. A list of names, other families, other cases, other people who had apparently asked the wrong questions or seen the wrong things. The Hendersons from 1981, the Kowalskis from 1985. The Johnsons from 1992. All missing persons cases that had gone cold, all families that had simply vanished without a trace. The notebook suggested they hadn't vanished at all. They'd been disappeared. Martinez realized she wasn't just investigating a single cold case. She was looking at evidence of a systematic elimination program that had been operating for decades, a shadow network within law enforcement that had been cleaning up loose ends and protecting corrupt operations through murder and intimidation. The camera that Patricia Morse found had been more than just a documentation tool. It had been insurance. Someone in the conspiracy had been creating a record of the crimes, either as leverage against their partners or as protection against betrayal. The hidden room had been a vault, preserving evidence that could bring down the entire network. But as Martinez dug deeper, she discovered that the conspiracy was far from dead. Several of the names in Cole's notebook were still alive, still in positions of power. Retired police officers who had gone into private security, former detectives who had become consultants, prosecutors who had moved into politics. The corruption had metastasized over the decades, spreading through the system like a cancer. And now that the camera had been discovered, now that the evidence was coming to light, Martinez realized that she and her team were in danger. Strange things began happening. Her police cruiser was vandalized. Her apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. She received anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing followed by hang-ups. The message was clear: drop the investigation or face the consequences. But Martinez had seen too much to back down. The photograph of the Harrison family's final moments haunted her dreams. The clinical descriptions of their suffering filled her with a rage that burned hotter than her fear. These people deserved justice, even if it came 47 years too late. She began working in secret, using her personal time to follow leads that the official investigation couldn't pursue. She digitized Cole's notebook and uploaded copies to secure servers. She reached out to journalists, activists, anyone who might be able to help expose the truth if something happened to her. And slowly, painstakingly, she began to map the full scope of the conspiracy. The money laundering operation Michael Harrison had discovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface was a vast network of corruption that included drug trafficking, illegal gambling, protection rackets, and murder for hire. The Harrison family had been collateral damage in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. But their camera, their final gift to the world, was about to become the weapon that brought their killers to justice. As Martinez prepared to make her first arrests, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That somewhere in the shadows, the same forces that had destroyed the Harrison family were mobilizing to destroy her. But she also knew that the truth, once released, would be impossible to contain. The camera had waited 47 years to tell its story. Now it was finally time for the world to listen. The first arrest came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, exactly 47 years and 3 months after the Harrison family disappeared. Detective Martinez stood outside the modest ranch house in Wauwatosa, watching as FBI agents led retired Detective Frank Morrison away in handcuffs. His name had been circled in red ink throughout Cole's notebook, marked as the cleanup specialist who sanitized crime scenes after the dirty work was done. Morrison was 72 now, a grandfather of 6 who coached Little League on weekends and volunteered at the local food bank. His neighbors would later tell reporters they couldn't believe such a kind man could be involved in something so heinous. But Martinez had learned that monsters rarely looked like monsters. They looked like ordinary people living ordinary lives, hiding extraordinary secrets. The arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Morrison had been a respected detective for 30 years, the kind of cop other cops looked up to. His conviction record was spotless, his reputation unblemished. But the evidence from the camera told a different story. Enhanced analysis of the photographs revealed Morrison's reflection in the dining room window, standing just outside the Harrison house on the night of the disappearance. Forensic experts had also found his fingerprints on the camera itself, prints that matched samples taken during his routine police employment screening decades earlier. But Morrison wasn't talking. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, he maintained his innocence, claiming he'd been framed by someone trying to discredit the police department. His lawyer argued that the photographs could have been doctored, that the notebook could have been planted, that the entire discovery was an elaborate hoax. The legal battle was fierce. Morrison's defense team hired their own forensic experts who challenged every piece of evidence. They questioned the chain of custody, the authenticity of the photographs, even the reliability of Detective Cole's deteriorating memory. For months, it seemed like the case might fall apart before it ever reached trial. But Martinez had been thorough. She'd anticipated every challenge, documented every step of the investigation, and built a case that was airtight. More importantly, she'd found other evidence that corroborated the camera's story. Bank records showed mysterious cash deposits in Morrison's account dating back to 1978. Phone logs revealed calls between Morrison and known organized crime figures. Property records showed he'd purchased a cabin in northern Wisconsin just weeks after the Harrison family disappeared, paying cash for a remote property that would have been perfect for disposing of bodies. The breakthrough came when Martinez decided to search that cabin. It had been sold multiple times over the years, but she obtained a warrant based on the notebook entries that mentioned a northern facility where subjects were taken for extended questioning. What she found there made her stomach turn. The cabin looked innocent enough from the outside, but the basement had been converted into something out of a nightmare. Concrete walls, industrial lighting, and worst of all, scratches in the cement that spelled out names: Sarah, Emma, Lucy, Michael. The Harrison family had been held there for months, just as Cole's notebook had indicated. Forensic analysis of the scratches confirmed they'd been made by fingernails, carved into the concrete by people desperate to leave some trace of their existence behind. But the cabin held more than just evidence of the Harrison family's final months. Martinez's team found remains, not complete skeletons, but fragments, bone chips and teeth that had been missed during the sanitization process. DNA analysis would later confirm they belonged to the Harrisons, finally giving the family the burial they'd been denied for almost 5 decades. The discovery of the cabin broke Morrison's resolve. Faced with physical evidence that he couldn't explain away, he finally agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. But his confession revealed that the conspiracy was even larger than Martinez had imagined. The money laundering operation Michael Harrison had discovered was just one tentacle of a vast criminal enterprise that had infected law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Police officers, prosecutors, judges, and politicians had all been compromised, creating a shadow system of justice that protected criminals while eliminating threats. Morrison named names. He detailed operations. He revealed burial sites and safe houses and bank accounts that had been used to fund the conspiracy for decades. His confession was a roadmap to corruption that stretched from Milwaukee to Chicago to Detroit, a network of dirty cops and crooked officials who had turned law enforcement into a criminal enterprise. The arrests came in waves. Retired police chiefs, former prosecutors, even a sitting judge found themselves in handcuffs as Martinez's investigation expanded. Some fled the country, others took plea deals. A few, like Morrison, chose to cooperate fully, hoping to reduce their sentences by helping to dismantle the system they'd helped create. But not everyone was caught. Several key figures in the conspiracy had died of natural causes over the years, taking their secrets to the grave. Others had covered their tracks so well that prosecuting them would be nearly impossible. The network that had killed the Harrison family had been wounded, but not destroyed. Martinez knew that her investigation had only scratched the surface. The notebook mentioned operations in other states, other cities, other families who had disappeared into the same shadow system. But she also knew that the camera had given her something precious, a starting point. Other cold cases began to be reopened. Missing persons reports were re-examined. Families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones suddenly had hope that they might finally get answers. The Harrison case became a template for how to investigate systemic corruption. Law enforcement agencies across the country began looking at their own cold cases with fresh eyes, wondering how many other families had been disappeared by the very people sworn to protect them. Media coverage of the case was intense. The story of a family that vanished during dinner, only to be found through a camera that waited 47 years to tell their story, captured the public imagination. Documentaries were made. Books were written. The case became a symbol of how corruption could hide in plain sight, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually surface. But for Martinez, the most important moment came when she stood in the cemetery where the Harrison family was finally laid to rest. The funeral was small, attended mostly by distant relatives and colleagues who had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. As she watched the caskets being lowered into the ground, Martinez thought about the camera that had made it all possible. How someone, probably Cole himself, had the foresight to document the crimes even as he participated in them. How that evidence had waited patiently in a hidden room like a time bomb set to explode decades after the fact. The Harrison family had been silenced for 47 years, but their story was finally being told. And in that telling, other voices were beginning to emerge. Other families, other victims, other secrets that had been buried in the shadows of a system that had forgotten its most basic purpose: to serve and protect. The camera had done more than solve a cold case. It had exposed a cancer that had been growing in the heart of law enforcement for decades, and while the treatment would be painful, while the process of reform would be slow and difficult, the healing could finally begin. As Martinez walked away from the cemetery, she carried with her the weight of responsibility. The Harrison family had waited 47 years for justice. How many other families were still waiting? How many other cameras were hidden in how many other rooms, holding evidence that could change everything? The investigation was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. But for the first time in decades, the truth was winning. And that, Martinez knew, was something worth fighting for. The ripple effects of the Harrison case spread far beyond Milwaukee. Within weeks of Morrison's arrest, similar investigations were launched in 17 states. The notebook that had waited in darkness for nearly half a century became a roadmap to corruption that stretched across the entire Midwest. Detective Martinez found herself at the center of a media storm she never wanted. News trucks lined her street, reporters ambushed her at coffee shops. Her phone rang constantly with calls from families desperate to know if their missing loved ones might be connected to the conspiracy. Each conversation broke her heart a little more. One call stood out among the hundreds. Margaret Kowalski, now 78, had been searching for her daughter's family since 1985. The Kowalskis had been one of the names in Cole's notebook. A young mother, her husband, and their 2 small children had vanished from their home in Green Bay on a snowy February night. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just another family that had simply ceased to exist. "I knew something was wrong," Margaret told Martinez during their first meeting. "The police, they barely looked. Said my daughter probably ran off with another man, took the kids. But Jenny would never do that. She was a good mother. She loved those babies more than life itself." Margaret had spent decades fighting a system that seemed determined to ignore her. She'd hired private investigators, contacted journalists, even consulted psychics. Nothing had worked. The official investigation had been closed after 6 months, filed away with a notation that the family had likely relocated voluntarily. But now, with Cole's notebook as evidence, Martinez could see the pattern. The Kowalski case had been handled by Detective Morrison and his partner, Detective William Hayes, the same team that had investigated the Harrison disappearance, the same team that had access to crime scenes, evidence, and witness statements. Hayes was now 67, living in a retirement community in Scottsdale. When FBI agents arrived at his door, he was watering his cactus garden, humming an old Sinatra tune. He seemed genuinely surprised to see them, but Martinez had learned not to trust appearances. Unlike Morrison, Hayes broke immediately. Maybe it was his age, or maybe he'd been carrying the guilt for too long, but when confronted with the evidence from Cole's notebook, he confessed to everything. The Kowalski family had been killed because Jenny's husband, David, had been a truck driver who'd accidentally witnessed a drug shipment being transferred at a rest stop. He'd been smart enough to write down license plate numbers, smart enough to realize he'd seen something he shouldn't have, but he hadn't been smart enough to keep quiet about it. David had called the police to report what he'd seen. The call had been routed to Hayes, who'd promised to investigate. Instead, Hayes had contacted his handlers in the conspiracy. The decision was made quickly. The entire family would have to disappear. Hayes described the night of February 18, 1985, in clinical detail. How they'd waited until the children were asleep. How they'd used Morrison's key to enter through the back door. How they'd subdued the family without waking the neighbors. How they'd transported them to the same cabin where the Harrisons had been held. The interrogation had been brutal. They'd tortured David for information about who else he might have told, what other evidence he might have collected. They'd threatened to hurt his wife and children if he didn't cooperate. But David had been telling the truth. He'd only called the police. He'd trusted the system to protect him. The family had been held for 3 days before they were executed. Hayes described it matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. 4 shots to the head, bodies dissolved in acid. The remains scattered across multiple locations to prevent discovery. Margaret Kowalski was in the room when Hayes gave his confession. Martinez had tried to convince her to stay home, to let the legal process run its course. But Margaret had waited 38 years for answers. She deserved to hear the truth, no matter how painful. She didn't cry when Hayes described her daughter's final moments. She didn't scream when he explained how her grandchildren had begged for their lives. She just sat there, stone-faced, absorbing every detail. When Hayes finished, she stood up slowly and walked out of the room without saying a word. Martinez found her an hour later sitting in her car in the parking lot, staring at a photograph of her daughter's family. It was from Christmas 1984, just 2 months before they disappeared. Jenny was holding her youngest, a toddler with bright blue eyes and a gap-toothed grin. David had his arm around his older son, both of them wearing matching sweaters that Jenny had knitted. They were so happy, Margaret whispered. Look at their faces. They had no idea what was coming. Martinez sat beside her in silence. What could she say? That justice would be served. That the system would make it right. The system had failed Margaret's family completely. It had not only allowed them to be murdered, but had actively participated in covering up the crime. More confessions followed. Hayes led investigators to burial sites across Wisconsin and Illinois. Some contained remains that could be identified. Others held only fragments, too degraded by time and acid to provide DNA matches. But each discovery was a small victory, a family finally brought home. The scale of the conspiracy became clearer with each arrest. The network had operated like a business, with territories and hierarchies and profit-sharing agreements. Police officers provided protection and intelligence. Prosecutors made cases disappear. Judges issued favorable rulings. Politicians provided legislative cover. The money had been enormous. Drug trafficking alone had generated millions in revenue. Add in illegal gambling, protection rackets, and murder for hire, and the conspiracy had been pulling in tens of millions annually. The corruption had been so profitable that it had become self-sustaining, recruiting new members and eliminating threats with ruthless efficiency. But the conspiracy had made one crucial mistake. They'd kept records. Cole's notebook wasn't the only documentation. As the investigation expanded, Martinez's team found safe deposit boxes, hidden computers, and coded ledgers that detailed decades of criminal activity. The evidence painted a picture of systematic brutality that shocked even seasoned investigators. Families had been murdered for asking questions. Witnesses had been eliminated before they could testify. Journalists had been killed for investigating the wrong stories. The conspiracy had operated like a shadow government with its own laws and its own justice system. Martinez often wondered what would have happened if Patricia Morse hadn't bought the Harrison house, if she hadn't found the hidden room, If the camera had remained buried for another decade or two, how many more families would have disappeared? How many more victims would have been silenced? The trials began in the spring of 2026. Morrison, Hayes, and 14 other defendants faced charges ranging from murder to racketeering to conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense attorneys fought every step of the way. They argued that the conspiracy was a fantasy, that the notebook was a fabrication, that their clients were being scapegoated by a justice system desperate to solve cold cases. They claimed that Cole had been mentally ill, that his confessions were unreliable, that the entire investigation was built on the delusions of a dying man. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The photographs from the camera, the scratches in the cabin's concrete walls, the DNA matches from scattered remains, the financial records that showed millions in unexplained cash flowing through the defendants' accounts. One by one, the jury delivered guilty verdicts. Morrison was sentenced to life without parole. Hayes received the death penalty. The others got sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement. Martinez watched each sentencing with mixed emotions. Justice was being served, but it felt hollow somehow. The Harrisons had been dead for almost 50 years, the Kowalskis for nearly 40. No amount of punishment could bring them back or erase the decades of grief their families had endured. But there was something else, a sense that the investigation had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Other cases were being reopened. Other families were getting answers. The camera that had waited so patiently in that hidden room had become a catalyst for change that would ripple through law enforcement for generations. The Harrison house was demolished in the fall of 2026. Patricia Morse donated the land to the city, which turned it into a small memorial park. A bronze plaque was installed near the entrance, listing the names of all the families who had been disappeared by the conspiracy. Martinez attended the dedication ceremony. She stood in the crowd, watching as Margaret Kowalski placed flowers at the base of the memorial. The old woman had aged visibly over the past 2 years, but there was something different about her now, a peace that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," Margaret said when she spotted Martinez in the crowd, "for not giving up, for believing me when no one else would." Martinez hugged her gently. "They're finally home," she whispered. "All of them." As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Martinez remained behind. She thought about the camera that had started it all, now sealed in an evidence locker somewhere. A simple device that had captured the most important photographs in law enforcement history. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. The Harrison family had waited 47 years to tell their story, but when they finally spoke, the world had listened. And in that listening, other voices had been heard. Other stories had been told. Other families had found their way home from the darkness where they'd been hidden for so long. The investigation was officially closed, but Martinez knew it would never really end. There were still missing persons cases to review, still cold files to examine, still families waiting for answers that might never come, but the camera had proven something important. That no secret stays buried forever. That justice, however delayed, will eventually find its way to the surface. And that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is a simple photograph, waiting patiently in the dark for someone brave enough to develop it. The Harrison family had been silenced for nearly half a century, but their final gift to the world was a voice that would echo through the halls of justice for generations to come. A voice that said, "Remember us, remember what happened here, and never let it happen again." The camera had kept its promise, the truth had been told, and in that telling, the dead had finally found their rest. The memorial park stood quiet under the autumn sky, but Detective Martinez knew the story wasn't over. In the weeks following the dedication ceremony, her phone had been ringing constantly. Families from across the country, all with the same desperate question. Could their missing loved ones be connected to this conspiracy? Each call was a reminder that the camera had done more than solve one case. It had torn open a wound that had been festering in law enforcement for decades. The notebook contained references to operations in 12 states, mentions of associates and partner networks that suggested the Milwaukee conspiracy was just one node in a much larger web. Martinez found herself leading a new task force, one that seemed to grow larger every week. FBI agents, state investigators, forensic specialists, all working to map the full extent of what they were now calling the network. The evidence trail led everywhere and nowhere, a maze of shell companies, coded communications, and financial transactions that disappeared into offshore accounts. But they weren't working in complete darkness anymore. The camera had given them something invaluable, a template. They knew what to look for now. The patterns of behavior, the methods of operation, the way evidence was manipulated and witnesses silenced. Other hidden rooms were discovered. In Chicago, investigators found a basement chamber behind a false wall in a former police captain's home. In Detroit, a storage unit rented under a false name contained boxes of photographs and audio recordings dating back to the 1970s. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every revelation. The psychological toll was immense. Martinez had seen crime scenes before, had worked homicides and missing persons cases. But this was different. This was systematic, methodical. The conspiracy hadn't just killed people, it had erased them from existence, leaving families to wonder and grieve without closure for decades. She started seeing a department psychologist, someone who specialized in helping investigators cope with prolonged exposure to extreme cases. The sessions helped, but they couldn't erase the images that haunted her dreams. The scratches in the concrete walls, the terror in the Harrison family's eyes in that final photograph, the clinical descriptions of torture in Cole's notebook. But there were moments of light in the darkness. When Margaret Kowalski called to say she'd finally been able to sleep through the night. When a father in Texas learned that his missing daughter hadn't run away, that she'd been a victim, not a runaway. When a cold case from 1987 was finally solved, bringing closure to a family that had spent 37 years searching for answers. The legal proceedings continued for months. Appeals were filed and denied. New evidence surfaced that led to additional arrests. The conspiracy, it turned out, had tentacles reaching into the highest levels of government. A federal judge was indicted. 3 state senators were arrested. A former FBI assistant director was found dead in his garage, an apparent suicide, with a note confessing to decades of corruption. Martinez often thought about Detective Raymond Cole, still alive in his nursing home, but lost in the fog of dementia. He was the one person who could have provided the most answers, but his mind was gone, scattered like leaves in the wind. Sometimes she wondered if the deterioration was real or if it was one final performance from a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception. The camera itself became a symbol. Other law enforcement agencies began conducting their own internal investigations, looking for hidden evidence and buried secrets. The Milwaukee Police Department was completely restructured, with outside oversight and new protocols designed to prevent corruption. But Martinez knew that the real change would take generations. She received letters from all over the world, families in other countries who had experienced similar disappearances, investigators who had found evidence of their own networks, journalists who were working to expose corruption in their own communities. The camera's story had become a rallying cry, proof that the truth would eventually surface no matter how deeply it was buried. One letter stood out among the hundreds. It came from a woman in Oregon whose brother had disappeared in 1979. He'd been a photographer, she wrote, someone who documented environmental crimes for a nonprofit organization. He'd been working on a story about illegal dumping when he vanished. His camera bag had been found empty by a riverbank, but his body was never recovered. Martinez forwarded the letter to the task force. Within weeks, they'd connected the case to a subsidiary network that had operated on the West Coast. The photographer had been killed not by the Milwaukee conspiracy directly, but by a similar organization that shared resources and intelligence. His photographs, it turned out, had been hidden in a safety deposit box under a false name. When investigators finally gained access, they found evidence of environmental crimes that led to dozens of arrests. The ripple effect continued to spread. Cold cases that had been closed for decades were suddenly active investigations. Missing persons reports that had been filed away were being re-examined with fresh eyes. The camera had started an avalanche of truth that was still gathering momentum. Martinez's personal life had suffered during the investigation. Her marriage had ended, a casualty of the long hours and emotional toll. Her friends had stopped calling, tired of conversations that always seemed to circle back to the case. But she couldn't let go. Every solved case, every family reunited with their loved ones' remains, felt like a small victory against the darkness. The task force compiled a final report that ran to over 3,000 pages. It documented systematic corruption in 17 states, involving hundreds of law enforcement officials and politicians. The conspiracy had operated for nearly 50 years, claiming an estimated 200 victims. Families had been destroyed, communities had been terrorized, justice had been perverted into its opposite. But the report also documented something else: the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on the missing, the way truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually find its way to the surface. The Harrison family's camera had been the key that unlocked it all, a simple device that had waited patiently in the darkness, holding secrets that would change everything. Martinez often wondered what Michael Harrison would think if he could see what his discovery had ultimately led to. His family's sacrifice had not been in vain. Their story had saved others. As the investigation officially concluded, Martinez found herself standing once again in the memorial park that had been built where the Harrison house once stood. It was evening, the same time of day when the family had sat down for their final dinner 47 years earlier. The bronze plaque gleamed in the fading light, reflecting the names of all the families who had been silenced by the conspiracy. But Martinez knew there were other names that would never be on any plaque. Victims who had disappeared so completely that their very existence had been erased. People who had been forgotten by everyone except the families who still searched for them. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Margaret Kowalski's number. The old woman answered on the second ring, her voice as clear and strong as ever. "Detective Martinez," Margaret said warmly. "How are you holding up?" "Better," Martinez replied. "I wanted to thank you for believing in the investigation, for never giving up hope." "Hope," Margaret repeated softly. "That's all we had for so long. Hope that someday, somehow, we'd learn the truth." They talked for a few more minutes, sharing memories of the investigation and plans for the future. Margaret was writing a book about her experience, hoping to help other families who were dealing with missing loved ones. She'd become an advocate, a voice for those who had been silenced. After the call ended, Martinez remained in the park as darkness fell. The streetlights came on, casting long shadows across the memorial. She thought about all the families who had been touched by the conspiracy, all the lives that had been destroyed by corruption and greed. But she also thought about the survivors, the people who had refused to give up, the investigators who had kept digging even when the trail went cold, the families who had demanded answers even when the system failed them. The camera had been their weapon, their tool for exposing the truth. But the real power had come from the people who had refused to let the dead be forgotten, who had insisted that every life mattered, every disappearance deserved investigation, every family deserved closure. As Martinez walked back to her car, she carried with her the weight of responsibility that came with the badge. The Harrison family had waited 47 years for justice. How many other families were still waiting? How many other secrets were buried in how many other hidden rooms? The investigation was over, but the work would never end. There would always be more cases to solve, more families to help, more truths to uncover. The camera had shown them the way forward. Now it was up to them to keep walking down that path, no matter how dark or difficult it became. The truth had been told. Justice had been served. But most importantly, the dead had finally been given a voice, and that voice would echo through the halls of justice for generations to come. A constant reminder that no secret stays buried forever. In the end, that was the Harrison family's greatest gift to the world. Not just the solution to their own mystery, but the proof that persistence and courage could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Their camera had waited 47 years to tell its story, but when it finally spoke, the world had listened. And in that listening, other voices had been heard, other stories had been told, other families had found their way home from the darkness where they'd been hidden for so long. The camera was silent now, locked away in an evidence room, but its legacy lived on in every reopened case, every answered question, every family finally reunited with their lost loved ones. The Harrison family had disappeared during dinner on a quiet Tuesday evening in 1978. But their story would live forever, a testament to the power of truth and the importance of never giving up hope. That's the story of how a camera waited 47 years to expose the chilling truth, and how that truth changed everything. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the cases that haunted investigators for decades. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and remember, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it takes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.